The best of Money Matters. The Hot Seat.
Welcome to the Hot Seat, a debate segment where ideas clash and insights spark. I'm your host, Hongbin Jeong. Behind closed doors in Singapore, this happens more often than many might think. A foreign domestic worker spends her week cooking and cleaning for one household. Then, on her single day off, she quietly heads to another household to do the same, all for some extra cash. But it's illegal in Singapore, and the law today is very clear. Foreign domestic workers are only allowed to work for their official employer. Now, this debate has been reignited last month by the case of Pido Erlinda Ocampo, who had been fined $13,000 for illegally engaging in part-time cleaning over several years. Netizens were split, with some saying she was just trying to make ends meet, while others insisted the rules are there for a reason. So should we treat this kind of part-time work as a crime? Is there an opportunity to modernize current legislation here? And at the heart of it all, who really benefits and who pays the price if helpers are allowed to work on their rest days? Well, before we hear from our guests and dive deeper into this debate, here's a disclaimer. The views and arguments presented by our interviewees do not necessarily reflect their personal beliefs or opinions. Instead, they're here to provide a fresh perspective on the topic at hand. So without further ado, joining us today is Gloria James-Civetta, who's a head lawyer at Gloria James-Civetta & Co., who will argue that there should be flexibility for foreign domestic workers to work part-time. On the other side, we have Yuri, senior associate at the Christopher Bridges Law Corporation, who will argue that they should not be allowed to have part-time jobs. Hi, both. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Hi.
All right. Well, I just want to start off by asking the both of you, given the reasons behind why some foreign domestic workers moonlight, is moonlighting really a crime that undermines the system? Is this law stuck in the past?
I think if you look at it, I would say that, technically and strictly speaking, it would mean that moonlighting should not appear to be a criminal offense. Mm-hmm. And I did speak about it 5 years ago, and I have not seen any changes as yet. The law seemed to be really stuck in the past. Mm-hmm. So I feel that there should be a change.
Right. Yuri, what are your thoughts?
I empathize with some of the reasons why foreign domestic workers moonlight. But like you said, I think the law is very clear, and that is covered under the FMA, right? Mm-hmm. So Ministry of Manpower is actually the authority in this area, and what they've clarified is that the purpose of the FMA is really for protecting and caring for the well-being of foreign employees. And you might be surprised to know, but during the 2021 amendments to the FMA to bolster enforcement efforts, one of the reasons for that was because syndicates were devising more and more complex schemes to get around enforcement. And so the law put in place is very much to protect these workers. And rather than it being backward, I would say that it's forward-looking. Mm-hmm. It is trying to prevent abuses even before it happens. So when foreign domestic workers moonlight, what they do is they remove themselves from this umbrella of protection that the government has put in place.
Well, many migrant workers have taken to social media to say that they take up part-time work out of necessity. One user even commented that their salaries aren't sufficient. They need to provide for entire families back home. Now, helper salaries here are notoriously low, often starting at around $600 to $800 a month. Their pay, in fact, here is lower than in countries like Hong Kong. So, Yuri, isn't it a bit unreasonable to expect a domestic helper to live comfortably or send money back home on such little pay without giving them other legal options to earn?
Maybe I'll break this down in two parts. So the first part is perhaps whether salary is little. Of course, it's by no means a lot. But there was a 2017 report which reported on a survey, and you are correct to say that the salaries are around $600 to $800 a month. But if you compare that to wages in Myanmar, Indonesia, Philippines, for example, that actually ranges between $300 over to $400 over. So I'm not too sure if we can say that it's low. Moreover, lots of other matters such as housing, income, medicine, healthcare, these are all covered under the FMA. Also, on the other part about providing for legal options, there are legal options in Singapore which are available. There are at least two of them. One of them is the Household Services Scheme. Now, under that scheme, there are companies that provide cleaning services. And foreign domestic workers who can actually do more and have the capacity to do so can actually consider that. Now, these companies, there were about 140 of them in 2023, servicing around 21,000 households in Singapore. These companies often pay overtime, so that is one option to earn more money. Another option would, of course, also be to sacrifice 3 of the working days in a month to do extra work for the employer, and the employer would be required to compensate them in addition to the pay that they are already getting.
Well, then, Gloria, if pay is the issue here, why can't people who, officially employ domestic helpers here pay more for their services? Can't we introduce like a minimum wage set for FTWs?
I mean, exactly. I mean, that would be my views. We should relook at to what would be the minimum salary for these FDWs. Earlier on, my learned friend has said that he went on to compare the salary that FDW is earning in Singapore compared to an income that they will be earning in their own home country. I think it's not right to compare because the standard of living is clearly different in Singapore compared to their home countries. And another thing we need to look at is Singapore is a developed country, so we need to establish at least some sort of basic minimum wage income. Hong Kong has it. Why can't we follow? I mean, there are other developed countries like Dubai and all that. I would say they pay more for the foreign domestic maids. So if locally an employer should be able to provide more. Well, if you actually break down the numbers, $600 a month and for a 26 work day brings you to about $23 a day for that 26 days. And if the maid is working for 8 hours a day, that brings about, say, roughly $3 an hour. I mean, if you look at it, it's not even $3 an hour, what can you get?
Right.
Maybe a plate of chicken rice. So I would say the minimum wage should be increased. So if I'm looking at it long term, maybe this would be a plan for Singapore to perhaps, the employers should be paying more for the maid. And if the maid has been with them progressively, they should be paying, after every 2 years of contract, they should be paying a bit more, I would say.
Well, let's talk about the risk as well. Part of the reason the Ministry of Manpower clamps down on this is because helpers are not insured for part-time jobs outside their official employment. So, Gloria, if something goes wrong here, say an accident while cleaning another home, who's responsible? I mean, wouldn't legalizing side jobs open up a whole can of worms? And how do we prevent exploitation from, unscrupulous middlemen or employers?
So, if the system is to be reconsidered, I would say that proper regulation ought to be put in place to ensure safety and compliance so that then there will be no one manipulating the FDW. So, and if the FDW is looking at working in these circumstances, I believe the system should have some regulations that would require the FDW to seek maybe approval from MOM or for any external employment with their employer's consent. So the view I take is that, if we have things like this put in place, there would be some form of check and balances to ensure that there's no form of exploitation, even from the employers themselves. Yeah, because there is a government body to look into these and to ensure that regulations are carried out.
Well, conversely here, I mean, if we don't have the flexibility, Yuri, won't current rules actually create more risks because everything goes underground? I mean, if helpers are going to do part-time work anyway, wouldn't it be safer to bring it into the open with proper regulation and contracts?
I think that legalization actually creates the exact opposite effect. It actually probably opens up an entire can of worms. So at the heart of the government initiative is really to ensure that these foreign domestic workers are here in Singapore. One employer on the work pass is liable and responsible for them. So if we have two employers, for example, and perhaps the foreign domestic worker had eaten something during his employment or her employment rather at the first employer's house, and then she goes on to the second employer's home and carries out a risky service, cleaning fans, and she gets injured in the process because she was dizzy, right? So you can see that in the chain of causation, there it is conceivable that both employers could come out to say that this wasn't caused by me. and then there could be a dispute. So the current position is very clear. There's only one employer, there's no dispute, you are liable. And you may be surprised to know that between 2017 and 2019, there was actually an average of 550 complaints of illegal deployment of foreign domestic workers. And what is very surprising is that 24% of these complaints were actually from foreign domestic workers themselves, which means that really, even with the law in place, there are employers who abuse them and take advantage of the system. So legalization could make this, in fact, even worse.
Okay, I think there's a lot of pros and cons here, but I believe a lot of people have been making calls to have these regulated arrangements. A lot of people have come up with different suggestions as well. For example, some netizens suggested allowing helpers to legally work 1 day a week for another employer under clear rules with levy and insurance obligations. This way, both helpers and Singaporean families could benefit. But Gloria, see, if we allow this, aren't we at risk of undermining the very idea of a rest day because the law guarantees helpers 1 day off a week for their own well-being?
I mean, I have to expect that the employer wouldn't make the maid work 24 hours in a day. There will be ample rest time and all that. I mean, even myself, I've seen my mother also employed a maid. Nobody makes the maid work overtime. So if you're looking at it, most of the rest day falls on a Sunday. And what do we see the foreign domestic workers doing? Spending a lot of time in certain pockets of Singapore. Yeah, they are actually outside. But do we see them actually doing meaningful activities? I would say no. Not really. They're just hanging around. They're probably doing the same activities day in, day out. So if you're looking at allowing them on their rest day to work, maybe a scheme such as a limited part-time work, maybe allowing them to work for 4 to 5 hours on the rest day, maybe that's something to consider. Because what I've seen is many of the domestic foreign workers, what they're looking at is ensuring that they can provide more money for their extended family back home. Giving them a limited part-time work, I would say that it might help to meet their obligations at home. And then at the same time, when they are learning and when they are doing such part-time work, you never know. Maybe they are learning a new skill that they can bring back home once their contract is done in Singapore. So, I mean, we have to keep an open mind on this.
Well, on the other hand, then, Yuri, I mean, if people say that you're getting rid of the rest days, couldn't the same be said of Singaporeans? We welcome a side hustle, even if it means no rest days. So why shouldn't FWDs have the same right to control how they use their free time?
Yeah, so I think the first point of it is that foreign domestic workers are not Singaporeans. They have a very unique legal status, right? They are here in Singapore because someone has agreed to bear that risk and responsibility for them. And their status as a vulnerable group has been recognized not just by the government, but also in the courts, where courts have constantly reminded and said in judgments that domestic maids are vulnerable victims and a category of persons in need of constant protection, right? So if we look at the FMA itself and the catering for one mandatory day of rest every month at least, right? This is not just for bodily and physical rest, but it is also there to provide networks of support outside of the household. And this is done because the FMA is put in place to care for these workers. So if something were to happen at home, for example, there could be somebody on the outside, some people that the foreign domestic worker could turn to. And this will be very vital if there is a need to stem violence and abuse of these maids.
Okay. I mean, I believe the fear among many Singaporean households is this. If helpers are allowed to do side jobs and find secondary income streams, won't their attention and loyalty be divided? Already, employers argue that they have to shoulder heavy costs, agency fees, levies, medical checkups. So, Gloria, is it fair for them to bear these costs while their helpers' labor benefits, other households? How then do you reassure employers who say, I'm paying so much levy insurance and salary, my helper's duty should be to my household, not someone else's?
I mean, it's a fair point that this has been raised. But on the other hand, if, as I've mentioned earlier, if the FDW is given limited part-time work, to be allowed to do this flexible work during the rest day. I would say that they should be able to maybe co-pay part of the insurance. Maybe that's one way to take away the burden from the employers for the fear of risk that anything can happen during the point in time when they, in a way, doing these flexible part-time work arrangements. And I do have another thought is because we don't want to open up a floodgate, right? So where I'm coming from is perhaps, it is my view that any new FDW coming to Singapore, maybe what we should be looking at is, not allowing them to do any work for at least a period of 2 years. No flexible part-time work arrangements to be made on their rest day. Maybe that's one way we can ensure also that once they have proven themselves, then maybe they can gain the trust from their employers that look, they are able to perhaps not cause any risk and would not be any burden to the employers. And the alternative, the best approach is for the employers to consider, paying more after 2 years of service as a FDW.
Okay, looks like a possible plan. Well, then, Yuri, let's flip that. I mean, Singapore is aging rapidly. Many families don't actually need a full-time maid, maybe just a few hours of help a week. So wouldn't part-time legislation be a more flexible solution? I mean, some helpers have been in Singapore for decades, effectively building their lives here. Can't we trust them with a little bit of more autonomy?
Yes. So perhaps for households who only need part-time services, cleaning services, they can look into the household services scheme. That would perhaps be the most appropriate. But as for maids or foreign domestic workers who are resident in their employer's place full-time, actually the issue really is not so much of trust, but rather legal clarity. So the system is designed around one employer being responsible, solely responsible, and there being no debate about that to care for these foreign domestic worker. And that is very clear, makes everything clear, right? And if we somehow complicate matters by putting in a second employer, third employer, then again, issues may start to arise. And I believe the relevant bodies, government bodies have also looked into possibilities such as that. And at the moment, what we have, the various schemes which foreign domestic workers can consider. So autonomy on the part of some cannot come at the cost of protection for everyone else. And that really is what the FMA is all about.
I think we've got some great perspectives from both of you here. So before we wrap up our debate, I want to ask the both of you, I mean, at the end of the day, is this debate about protecting workers or protecting Singapore's system of cheap full-time help? In 10 years, what kind of system do you think we'll have? Gloria, you want to go first?
I'm actually on the fence of it. As much as we want to ensure that Singapore has a good system put in place, yeah, but on the other hand, it should not be viewed as the low income FDWs is going to be, it's not up to par with the rest of the developed world. Yeah. In 10 years from now, that will be 2035, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, 1/3 of the population of Singapore would be above 65. Yeah. We're going to have an aging population, as you have rightfully pointed out. What I'm looking at is perhaps we might have a system, in 10 years' time with a minimum wage and maybe alternatively a salary range, depending on the number of years of experience this FDW has in Singapore. And maybe, for if they're employed to take care of anyone above 65 years, maybe to stop calling them as FDW and perhaps calling them home care assistants. That's my view.
All right. Well, Yuri, what are your thoughts?
Well, I surely hope that after today's discussion, viewers and listeners will not have the takeaway that it is really a matter of keeping our cheap workforce, but of course, really that the measures put in place are more to protect and look after foreign domestic workers. Of course, if there are studies or there are opportunities for further enhancements and further improvements to the law, I personally would welcome that as well.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much both for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
We've been speaking to Gloria James-Civetta, who is the head lawyer of Gloria James-Civetta & Co., and Yuri Tan, senior associate at Christopher Bridges Law Corporation. This has been The Hot Seat, and I've been your host, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.